Hello and welcome. I'm Alina, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, coming to you as usual from Washington, D.C. So we're having this discussion on responding to Russian cyber attacks at a truly somber moment as Russia continues to build up military forces surrounding Ukraine. While we don't know what will happen tomorrow or in the next few days in terms of a renewed Russian military invasion of Ukraine, we know that cyber operations have become part and parcel of Moscow's broader toolkit of war. For years, Ukraine has been a testbed for Russia's growing and sophisticated arsenal of cyber weapons. Just last month, Kremlin-linked actors launched a major cyber attack against more than a dozen Ukrainian government ministries. And Russian cyber attacks to Ukraine don't stay confined to Ukraine. As the 2017 NotPetya attack clearly showed, the costly cyber attack to date spread across multiple countries and affected multiple international companies. So what this means is that it's critical for the United States and Europe to be prepared to respond not just to conventional military actions that we may see in the days ahead, but also cyber operations and other threats in the so-called hybrid domain. Today, we have a truly incredible, distinguished group of experts to discuss the current situation and how the West can respond. Krebs is a partner at the Krebs Stamos Group and the former director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, at the Department of Homeland Security. President Toomas Hendrik Ilves is a distinguished fellow at CEPA and former president of the Republic of Estonia. And Nicole Perloff is the cybersecurity journalist and author of one of the most terrifying books I have ever personally read and highly recommend for that reason. This is how they tell me the world ends. I truly look forward to this discussion that's going to be led by Maggie Miller, cybersecurity reporter at Politico. Maggie, thanks so much, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. Great to have all of you here for this incredibly timely event, and so glad it is being hosted. And I want to jump right into the conversation and go straight to Nicole. The book that was just mentioned is actually one of the most terrifying books I've ever read, and I also report on cybersecurity. This is how they tell me the world ends. I've read it personally twice, and the prologue, which you were saying was actually added later, involves your time spent on the ground in Ukraine in the wake of the NotPetya attack and talking to Ukrainians who had experienced a lot of their essential services being disabled and cut off. Can you speak to that experience and how that applies to the current situation between Russia and Ukraine right now and kind of set the scene for what Ukraine is facing?
Thanks, Maggie, and thank you so much to the Center for European Policy Analysis. This really could not be happening at a more timely point in history. And just watching the headlines and thinking about the blowback, I do think sometimes my title, "This is how they tell me the world ends," was not hyperbolic enough. What I saw in Ukraine, it was important to me to go there in the wake of the NotPetya attack, but I actually couldn't get there until maybe a year later. And that actually ended up being better for some reasons because I got to see the long tail of these attacks. So what I saw was that almost 2 years after the NotPetya attack, this was a Russian attack on Ukraine in 2017, their railway systems were still not up to speed. Their postal services were still not up to speed. I mean, this was an attack that used a Ukrainian tax software company as a Trojan horse to break into any Ukrainian government agency that used this tax software and a number of other newspapers and electrical utilities, and basically decimated their systems with what looked like ransomware, but wasn't ransomware at all. It was just code designed to sabotage and wipe their systems. And it got out. It hit any company that had even a single employee working remotely from Ukraine. A lot of people thought that was just sloppiness and pure collateral damage. I think the thinking has since changed that no, this was either a way to deflect attention from Ukraine and Russia in particular, or this was a way of punishing any business that did any kind of business in Ukraine. But what was critical to remember is that this was an attack that caused an existential crisis to companies like Merck, like Maersk, the global shipping company, Pfizer, a FedEx subsidiary. They were all hit. Merck had to tap into the CDC's emergency supplies of the Gardasil vaccine that year because their vaccine production systems had been paralyzed in that attack. And so when I was in Ukraine, I was able to sit down next to the people who did the forensics of this attack. And their main takeaway was that Ukraine is really Russia's test kitchen for cyber attacks. They are the ones that have been on the receiving end of power grid antics, where Russia shut down the power in Western Ukraine, and then a year later did the same in Kiev. They've been on the receiving end of these wiper attacks. And basically what they said to me was, you in the United States better watch very carefully what they are doing here in Ukraine, because we believe that we are the test kitchen, but we believe that you might ultimately be the end target. And when this comes for you, it will be so much worse because you are so much more automated than we are here. And that is something that has really stuck with me. The other thing is, since I left Ukraine, what I've seen in other places are these really disturbing Russian attacks that play around with attribution. I mean, the attack that keeps me up at night still was an attack on Petro Rabai, which was a Saudi petrochemical facility. And using a series of 0 days or unknown vulnerabilities in the Schneider electric safety locks at that plant, which is the very last thing that you use to stave off some kind of explosion, these hackers neutralized the safety locks. And fortunately, it triggered a bug and it shut down the plant. And the immediate suspect was Iran, because there had been a series of attacks by Iranian hackers on Saudi oil facilities. It took about a year before Mandiant discovered that no, this was actually a graduate research university outside Russia. And we've seen similar situations over and over again. I mean, the opening ceremony of the Olympics in South Korea were hit by a cyber attack. The immediate thinking was this is North Korea. No, later we learned it was the GRU. There were attacks on French television stations a number of years ago where someone put up pro-ISIS propaganda, and only later did we learn, no, this was the GRU. So we know that they've been playing around with these capabilities in Ukraine. We know that they've been playing around with attribution because of the cases I just mentioned. And also we've caught them hacking into Iran's attack command and control servers. You know, what can they do to sort of pull off this kind of attack, but have it be blamed on someone else, essentially? And what we haven't seen is a geopolitical conflict that would create a motivation for Russia to use these capabilities and the access it already has in too many cases all over the world, including the West, in some kind of coordinated nation-state attack. But this is where I pay very close attention to Putin's remarks. And last September, he said something that was very petrifying for me. He said, if the United States gets involved at all in our business here, and I think he was referring to Ukraine because they were amassing troops on the border, that will be a red line. And the red line terminology is interesting because that is a Western, predominantly US diplomatic term. That is not, there is no Russian translation or Russian equivalent. That is a US term. And I think what he is saying is that if the West gets involved, or if they stop me in Ukraine, there will be consequences. And I think the consequences we should expect is cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. And so that is, I'll stop there. So I'm sure the other panelists have thoughts on this, but that is where my head is at right now. That is where my thoughts are.
It's a truly terrifying outlook, and thank you for laying out the background on this. And again, I can't recommend your book enough. I think it should be required reading on cybersecurity issues. I want to turn to President Ilves, who of course was president of Estonia during a time of massive cyber attacks against his own nation in 2007, had an earlier taste even than Ukraine of some of these destabilizing attacks. Can you speak to what occurred in 2007 and how this might be a taste of what we could see in terms of cyber warfare if, you know, Russia were to launch some of its capabilities on Ukraine and other NATO members as well? And President Ilves, I believe you're still on mute.
Yeah, since we were, at least publicly, the first recipients of what turned out to be a state-on-state attack, then it was harder to figure out what was going on. But we did eventually. I mean, if you see you can't access any sites in your own country, but you find out you can access the Financial Times and the New York Times and Washington Post, you go, something's weird. But these were, by today's standards, primitive DDoS or distributed denial of services attacks, which at the time were basically run by botnets consisting of mafia-controlled computers. I mean, 25% of computers, PCs in the world are contaminated with some kind, or were at the time, were contaminated with some kind of downloaded malware, which could be then activated to send out signals, which was primarily for spam at the time. But spam, it's like that thing on the wall behind you. It goes out in all directions, but you can reprogram it to the spam to actually hit the botnet to hit one or another or a third. So, I mean, that was then. I mean, we saw a considerable escalation a year later with in Georgia, when DDoS attacks were combined with kinetic attacks. Today, we have far more powerful tools for DDoS attacks with, say, closed circuit television, routers. These are new ways of doing it. The other thing that was important to note, I have to mark this, is that because the rest of the world was so primitive, because NATO, aside from the US, or let's say the NSA and GCHQ, had some clue about these things, but the rest of the ambassadors in NATO did not believe us. They thought, oh, you're being Russophobic again, you Estonians. And that just caused, now I think there's a greater deal of, I mean, the sophistication is, I hope, is better, though indicative is that took place in 2007. On the eve of the Munich Security Conference here, I'm not there, but in Munich, in 3 days. The first time there was ever even a panel on cybersecurity was in 2011. So, I mean, before that, it was just not discussed, and it was not considered a serious issue of security. And that sort of is slowly dawning on people that, in fact, we are far more vulnerable in the digital world. And there is a fundamental change that's taken place, which is that up till the end of the last millennium, force was the unit, force, which according to Newton is mass times acceleration, was the unit of, by which, or the concept by which you attack the nation, because those were kinetic attacks, be it rocks or spears or nuclear bombs. They all fell under force equals mass times acceleration. The problem is there is no mass in a cyber attack. Acceleration is distance divided by time squared. There's distance, for all intents and purposes, collapses on Earth. I mean, if you're going to cyber attack Pluto, it'll take a little while, but it's far to go, and there's a time difference. On Earth, Tokyo, Torino, Toronto, Tallinn, whatever, they're all the same. They're as far away as each one is, which should completely change our concept of how we do security, which, because it's been kinetic up till now, things like NATO, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not because we are so wonderful up here, but rather it is because of bomber range, fighter refueling, troop transport, tanks, refueling. It's all based on a kinetic model, whereas it no longer matters And you can completely shut down a country, no matter where it is, if you do it right.
And I want to move over to Chris, who, of course, led CISA. Well, he was the first director of CISA as sort of this drumbeat of threats and attacks increased. And I want to ask you a little bit about where Russia stands in terms of its capabilities, and also, what you saw in terms of Russian probing while you were director of CISA of U.S. critical infrastructure, and how very well Russia could, target U.S. critical infrastructure if this escalates beyond Ukraine.
Well, it's funny hearing a little bit of the past history of Russian activities between President Ilves and Nicole. And I remember almost every one of these events. I almost remember where I was sitting or what I was doing. When I think to the NotPetya attack, it was a Tuesday morning, June 27th. I was sitting in the ear, nose, and throat office of out in Fairfax, Virginia, and I had two kids that were about to get tubes in their ears. And I was just scrolling through Twitter, and we, started seeing some suspicious activity, or more accurately, some reporting that banks and railways, not just in Ukraine, but Russia as well, were getting knocked offline. And so at the time, I was not yet at CISA or the CISA predecessor, but nonetheless passed the information over to Jeanette Manfra, who was leading the team over there. And said, hey, what's going on here? And so we did a little bit of digging. And as the day wore on, it came pretty clear that there was a significant event. And keep in mind that this was just a month after WannaCry, the North Korean attack. And so 2017, first off, was quite a dramatic event, and including just coming off the heels of the second Ukraine power grid attack. And I think that's one of the takeaways that I have more than anything, is that between the 2015 Russian attack on the Ukrainian grid and the 2016 attack, they improved their tradecraft. They became more sophisticated. And so in that intervening 4 or 5 years, I would assume that the tradecraft, the capabilities, has also improved. I mean, you talk about the events in the Gulf attacking some of the safety systems. It just shows this continuous progress, that they're investing significant research and development capabilities, not just within their military institutions, but also across their DARPA equivalents. And that's a concern. And really, when you step back and think about it, virtually every country on the face of this earth is developing some sort of intelligence collection and espionage capability that is enabled by information technology and cyber. But more worrisome is the number of countries are also developing destructive capabilities. And I'll point back to this prior summer, CISA and the FBI released an alert talking about Chinese intelligence operations against natural gas pipelines. And that was in 2013. So that's almost a decade ago. So it is quite concerning that this not just espionage, but destructive attacks or other coercive attacks on critical infrastructure services are becoming just part of the regular arsenal. So where are they now? There was some good reporting both out of CISA, NSA, and the FBI, as well as out of Mandiant recently, that gave kind of the laydown of how between the military intelligence units that we've talked about, the GRU, the FSB, and the SVR, of course, of the Nobelium or SolarWinds or whatever campaign we want to talk about, they have significant capabilities that have been used visibly recently. So SVR with the espionage campaign against U.S. agencies through the SolarWinds Orion platform, and other information technology, by the way. And then you have the FSB, and I'll point back to the summer of 2020, when there were Russian assets likely connected to the FSB that were going after various critical infrastructures here in the US, including aviation assets. And they did make some incursions adjacent to election infrastructure. So that was a bit of a dicey summer. Ended up, they were more of a spray and pray sort of technique. And then, of course, the GRU. So the way I see it is that Putin and the Kremlin have a wide array of capabilities on the technical side for things like intelligence collection, which I assume they are using quite aggressively right now to understand in Kyiv what exactly the Zelensky regime is thinking, who they're talking to, what sort of support they're getting. Also at Western capitals, to understand, to Nicole's point about red lines, of what are the Western allies of Ukraine going to pledge and deliver in terms of non-lethal aid. But I also assume, as we saw in the Whispergate campaign from a couple of weeks ago, that defaced websites and there were some other underlying destructive attacks, is that they're preparing the ground, that there's an operational preparation of the environment, and that if Putin, again, I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know if anybody other than Putin knows what's going to happen, but if they do decide to push the go button, I would expect that, prior to any sorts of tanks or troops rolling across the border, you'd see 48 to 72 hours in advance of electronic warfare, of cyber attacks against communications infrastructure. You'd probably see some space-based stuff with dazzling and blinding of overhead surveillance assets. And you probably see some softening up of ground positions through kinetic missile strikes and other air campaigns. But cyber is a fairly low cost technique that they can use, and it gives them an advantage both of disabling situational awareness as well as creating a little bit of havoc and confusion, and in part introducing that fog of war.
Mm. And I'm going to aim this question at Nicole, but both President Ilves and Chris, if you want to weigh in on this. The other issue is it's not just Russian government capabilities, but there's also a lot of hacking groups, ransomware, specifically groups that are believed to be based in Russia that were behind some of the most devastating attacks in this past year, public devastating attacks like Colonial Pipeline and the attacks on Kaseya and JBS. There have been negotiations between the Kremlin and the Biden administration on trying to crack down on some of these groups. And we saw Russia arrest about a dozen individuals alleged to be behind or part of the REvil hacking group, including one who may have been behind the Colonial Pipeline attack. Nicole, how do you think that some of these tensions ramping up between the US and Russia will impact these ongoing negotiations around cracking down on ransomware groups? And then also, if Russia were to invade and the US were to impose sanctions, how would, that impact the ability for Russia to hit back at the US, through a non-governmental channel potentially?
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad Chris raised SolarWinds. Just briefly, we have no conclusions that we have effectively kicked the Russians out of those compromised networks. I mean, the SVR is very skilled at planting backdoors. When they hacked the White House and the State Department in 2014, 2015, and I interviewed the people who were brought in to remediate that attack, they said, Nicole, it was like hand-to-hand digital combat, trying to kick them out of those systems. At one point, they actually took over the RSA NetWitness investigation tool, so forensic investigators' investigative tools, and manipulated it so that it wouldn't find their backdoors. So that is the adversary we're dealing with SolarWinds, which was a fairly recent attack, and which we didn't even notice, or no one noticed, until 9 months or so in. And so, they are there, and we don't know whether we ever really got them out. On ransomware, my interpretation, and I have no basis for this other than my reporting over the years, my interpretation of those arrests of those ransomware criminals, not that far back, what was it, a month ago or 2 months ago, was Putin was signaling, isn't this nice? Would it be nice if I could go round up all of these guys for you? But if you try and stop me over here, there's going to be none of this. The story to me with ransomware is, at best, ransomware is enabled by Russia because it provides immunity to these cyber criminal groups. It basically, I say this in my prologue, but Russia has only two rules for its cyber criminals. One, when we call in a favor, you do what we ask. And two, you don't hack inside the motherland, which is why in all of these cases, we see that if the code, first thing it does is search your computer for its default language setting. And if it's Russian, it moves right along. It doesn't infect you. So ransomware, at worst, could be directed for some of these nation state attacks. And it's a useful tool, because how do you respond as a country to something that looks like it's coming through a transnational actor? What if this ransomware group that just hit your pipeline isn't based in Russia? What if they're based in Ukraine? And so it's an asymmetrical playing field, in part because proxies play a major role. And I think, unfortunately, in the United States, we are at a disadvantage in some cases in responding to these attacks. Why? We'll just look at Colonial Pipeline, right? This was a ransomware group that came for the IT systems at this pipeline, this American pipeline. So badly did they take out their systems and prevent access to their billing systems and shake confidence in the security of the OT systems, the pipeline itself, that Colonial took the preemptive step of shutting down the pipeline. And we saw the panic buying at the pumps. We saw the fuel prices spike. We saw nonstop flights get grounded on their way to their destination. What we didn't see was there was a confidential Department of Energy assessment that said, as a country, we can only afford 2 to 3 more days of downtime from this. And it took me aback. It wasn't so much the gas and the jet fuel, it was the diesel that refineries required to operate. And so the DOE found that 2 or 3 days of this more would have brought the US economy to its knees. And to me, that's stunning. And you have to remember how it happened. It happened because they weren't using 2-factor authentication. They forgot to deactivate an old employee account. There was a stolen password. And when they were hit and the government tried to help, they basically told them to go away for now. And they ended up paying the ransom. And later, the DOJ and FBI were able to recoup some of that ransom. But if that's all it takes to basically hold the American economy hostage and hold a pipeline hostage, we better wake up. We better wake up to Russia's capabilities here, because that was a bumbling cyber criminal group. Now imagine that attack or a series of coordinated ransomware attacks that appear to come from cyber criminals, but are in fact nation state directed. And, I hear friends who are not involved in cybersecurity talking about the Ukraine situation right now, and they say, but like, what could they do here? Isn't this really a European problem? And then the answer is no. And it's to President Ilves's point, distance collapses. We are not on an island protected by 2 oceans anymore. Doesn't exist on the internet. And unfortunately, Russia understands something much more than Americans do, which is the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure and just how little visibility our government agencies, who have the best of intentions, have into that critical infrastructure, because the vast majority of it is in private sector hands where agencies like the NSA cannot look. And so all we have is basically awareness and giving these critical infrastructure operators good information about the threat, about best practices, about cyber hygiene. We encourage them to tell agencies like CISA, tell us when you've been breached. But in most cases, there's not even a breach notification requirement. SolarWinds would have never been required to tell the US government in some cases that they had been breached, so long as that attack didn't hit PII, personal identifiable information. Mandiant was not required by law to disclose that attack when it happened. They did it because they knew this is a major national security threat. So we have a long way to go. And unfortunately, I think this is the situation that is really going to test our blind spots.
And Chris or President Ilves, I'll go to you if you have thoughts on the same question.
I'll let Chris go first.
Oh, or Chris.
Look, I think a lot of what Nicole said, spot on. I do think, though, that any sort of direct attack against U.S. infrastructure in the initial stages of any possible Russian activity against Ukraine is probably not in the playbook. I think they would constrain any electronic warfare and any cyber within Ukraine against Ukrainian targets. Now, I think what the real question mark happens is how significant the sanctions package the U.S. and other allies might launch that would dictate further action. If they're significant, you could see some directed action against critical infrastructure. And that's why CISA, the FBI, NSA, and others have been meeting with critical infrastructure partners, have been briefing them, have been sending out alerts, Saturday's Shields Up notification from Jen Easterly and CISA. But I do think, though, the most likely response from Russia to any sanctions is probably on the critical exports side, where they start limiting exports of palladium, aluminum, titanium, ammonium nitrate, critical exports from Russia that the West and others. I mean, you think about the impact that would have on semiconductors and chips. It would be a significant supply chain impact. So I think that's kind of the what I would expect. On the ransomware side, I mean, I've always thought that ransomware actors benefited the Kremlin for probably three reasons. First is that it actually, it gives employment, gainful employment to a cohort in their 20s and 30s in Russia that otherwise don't have particularly rosy job prospects. And so it, idle hands and all that. The second is it actually brings in revenue. It brings in a good chunk of money, and to the tune of billions of dollars. That as recently as just the other day, where Chainalysis reported about the billions and billions that flow through Moscow in cryptocurrency laundering. It also builds a strategic cyber force. And I do have some questions, and I maybe wonder a little bit too much out loud about it, but the recent actions, as Nicole was pointing out, about rolling up some of the ransomware operators and, hey, wouldn't this be nice if we could partner? I think there's also a possibility that the FSB and others are consolidating control over some of these actors that have access. So a lot of these, the frontline ransomware crews, some of them are just access brokers. They constantly churn through compromising Western networks, and they keep a foothold. And so now if the FSB can consolidate that, they've got some troops if things do kind of escalate. And then the last point there, I think, is that it actually, ransomware in general, aligns with the Kremlin's strategic objectives to destabilize the West and lose, make us here. I was in Washington, D.C., couldn't get gas for 5 days after Colonial. Help make us lose a little bit of confidence in our government. And so the way we get out of this, just in general here in the US at least, there's been a market failure, as I think Nicole's hitting on, in that we don't have requirements. The negligence standard in civil suits hasn't really particularly changed the basics of cybersecurity hygiene and requirements across the broad set of private sector private sector businesses. And so I would expect to see a significant uptick in conversation in Congress, not just on incident reporting, which is, it's absolutely insane that we don't have a basic incident reporting requirement, but what does basic cybersecurity requirements across critical infrastructures, particularly those that really hold up our economic stability, what does that look like? And doing it in a nuanced way that's effective across a massive infrastructure base like we have here in the US is really hard.
President Ilves, if you want to speak to the ransomware threat, especially what the EU and NATO can do.
I didn't want to talk about the ransomware. I'm going to talk about, look, you take APT 28 and 29. They have attacked the US Congress, the State Department, the Bundestag, the Stiftungen, or the think tanks in Berlin, the Dutch Foreign Ministry, the Italian Foreign Ministry. I mean, you go on, up to and including WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. Now, what we do not understand wherever we are is that this, for them, it's all the same. And as I meant, this sort of taking off from when I said that space and time cease to matter, it doesn't matter to them. The politics matters and how hard it is to get in. And our problem is that because what we today called cyber grew out of the intelligence community, be it NSA, GCHQ, DSGE, whatever, it grew out of spying. And spies don't tell each other stuff. And okay, you can have the Five Eyes. They do tell a limited group of what's going on. But the big point is that we are approaching this the wrong way. And it's summed up by an experience we had from my little country about 12 years ago when we discovered a Russian worm in our military networks. So we went to NATO. You know, we're NATO allies. We say, hey, oh, look what we found. And they said, oh, you too. That is the wrong response. And so, I mean, I just mentioned APT 28 and 29 because they're fairly well known, but I mean, and apparently they were somehow involved with solar winds, I read the other day. But my point is that we have to rethink this stuff. I mean, concepts of national security and sovereignty have to be conceptually rethought where we are today. And, you know, as long as, I mean, now with the departure of the UK, I mean, basically Five Eyes is nothing to do with Europe. I mean, we need a different way of looking at it. And also, while we're at it, I mean, why do we not include South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia? In fact, any country that we kind of consider a liberal democracy with, you know, fundamental rights and freedoms and blah, 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 all that good stuff. I mean, which renders like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as I mentioned, pretty much, I mean, it's not useless because, you know, you still have tanks coming over borders or missiles, but nonetheless, we need to rethink our security paradigm so that we can get out of this thing where we can't share information, where we don't talk to each other. We don't have meetings of, you know, Latvians and Estonians with the US or with Japanese discussing how one or another group attacked all 3 or 4 countries. And so I think this is a conceptual problem we must overcome in security policy.
And I want to move over. I'm going to actually go back to Chris real quick, and then I'll also see if Nicole has any thoughts on this, which is, you know, Chris, you mentioned the sanctions negotiations around, you know, hitting back at Russia potentially for any sort of incursion into Ukraine. And I know I was speaking with senators on Capitol Hill last week that think that the sanctions may be placed on Russia for all attacks that have already taken place against Ukraine. You know, what are your thoughts on that? And also, you know, what more can the Senate and the Biden administration do to respond to some of these debilitating attacks on Ukraine? And then, of course, you know, at a much more escalated level on our own U.S. critical infrastructure. And then, you know, Nicole, in a minute, if you have thoughts as well.
So I think the important thing to keep in mind with any sort of sanctions approach to the Kremlin is that the US does not act unilaterally. Sanctions exist within a broader economic ecosystem that requires buy-in from allies. And so Germany and France and the UK and others are absolutely critical partners in any sort of response to a Russian incursion into Ukraine. And as a result, there are other economic interests and externalities that factor into ultimately what comes out the other end of the pipe. And so what I would expect to see is probably some targeting of banks, some of the significant financial institutions, but I would not expect to see too much on the energy sector, which is really one of the national champions of Russia, in part because, you know, there are critical dependencies in Europe, and that would create a lot of economic instability if you cut off a good bit of that pipeline. Now, that's my opinion. That's my talking to other folks about it. But that it makes a bit of sense to me. There are some other areas that we can limit them, though. It's not just about what comes out of Russia, it's what goes into Russia. And so one of the conversations ongoing right now is cutting off the availability of semiconductors and chips that could go into Russia. And that could have a pretty significant impact on any sort of advanced or economic aspirations of Russian businesses, which would be, I think, again, a big hit on the Kremlin. But ultimately, where I have always been a big fan of targeting is the oligarchs, the close friends, and the family of Putin and his immediate orbit. There's just far too much of this whatever the resources, however they came about it over the last several decades. But that money is flooded into the West, and it's created a dependency. If you're talking London, Latin America, even in Miami, there are things we can go after. There are things that I think would make those around Putin quite upset, and perhaps that's one additional angle or thread that they could pull.
And Nicole, do you have any thoughts on this of how sanctions, might help push back against Russia, and anything more that Congress and the Biden administration can do on this?
Well, I think Chris just hit on the major points. I thought it was interesting at Biden's first summit in Geneva with Putin when he said, I told him, how would you feel if something took out one of your pipelines? And a lot of people just said that's Biden being folksy. I actually took that as, yes, we have a real threat here. But I think Chris is right. There's so much dependency among our European allies now on Russia's gas and its pipeline infrastructure that I don't think that we would go there first. I think the oligarchs is very interesting. I think it's interesting that Putin, some of the open source intelligence suggests that Putin actually thinks that it was the CIA that was behind the Panama Papers and release, and that was, maybe part of the thinking about some of their election interference and disinformation campaigns, which is interesting. I think, Putin's power is money. It's his relationships with the oligarch. It's the oligarchs, the deals that they have struck. And so exposing those relationships, exposing the corruption is a lever, a powerful lever that the West could pull on. And then beyond that, I think, I don't know what will happen. Chris said this earlier, and I agree. I don't know if Putin knows what he's about to do. It was interesting to see that meeting between Putin and Lavrov, which was ridiculously staged yesterday, where Lavrov said, there might be opportunities for discussions. It's just, I don't know if they know what they're about to do. I think, the first response, as we've said it, is sanctions, and then where it could go next. I think, the financials would probably be a critical piece.
And President Ilves, I wanted to get your take on the international aspect of this, and the EU and NATO. I know, of course, that Anne Neuberger, one of the top cyber officials in the Biden administration, was in the EU last week, 2 weeks ago, talking with counterparts there about what more can be done to help Ukraine and push back against Russia. Do you believe the EU and NATO is doing enough to address cyber threats from Russia? And what more can be done there? What more can be done to help Ukraine? Any thoughts around that?
Well, we have been, not the EU. The EU is, I think, is insufficiently concerned about cyber. They have ENISA, which for some odd reason is based in Athens, and before that was based in Heraklion, which is on the island of Crete, which is not exactly the place to be. Has not really addressed these issues at all. And in fact, you can see it from a whole host of EU policies that we see, for example, with the Digital Market Act, which does not take security policy into account at all, zero zippo. And SIPA has actually addressed this issue. On a bilateral basis, soon as the cyber attack took place in 2015, we were down there, and we sent our best people down there. We're very actively involved both on the cybersecurity and also the digital infrastructure of Ukraine. So, I would say we have lots of people in Ukraine strictly for the digital / cybersecurity side, both developing digitizing Ukraine and securely, and also dealing directly with cybersecurity. I don't know who else is involved. We just end up because, in Brussels, if you're Estonian, they'll say, "Oh, you're Estonian. Can you fix my computer?" And so it's more of a reputational thing than it necessarily is reality on the ground. But we get invited. So, but as the EU, which is, I would say, so I mean, it's as strong as the weakest link, and the weakest link is very weak. And therefore, you know, I mean, as I said, it goes back to the DDoS attacks already, where when we talked about DDoS attacks, and, you know, major policymakers were like, what is a DDoS attack? And okay. So yes and no. I think that Ukraine is getting a fair bit of help. I'm sure that both GCHQ and NSA are, and DSGE, I mean, the better sort of agencies of Europe and the United States are, and the UK obviously, are intimately involved in looking over what's happening. But I still think that from a security policy point of view, going beyond just strictly cyber, but again, starting from the position that distance ceases to matter and everyone is vulnerable, that we need to have sort of develop a new concept of what security and defense is in an era where it's no longer kinetic, and, you know, same people doing the same bad stuff all over the place.
And it looks like, well, as I think one of you mentioned, you never know what President Putin is thinking, but it looked like there might be some type of hope this morning, given some promises. There might be movement of, you know, Russian troops, some away from Ukraine, but at the same time, certain bases being reestablished. It's very unclear to see, you know, what exactly is going to happen on the ground. But should, you know, Russia go through with this trajectory of moving troops away, and I'm going to start with Chris for this, but then Nicole and President Ilves, if you want to weigh in here, you know, what do you think, you know, Russia could still do to Ukraine, the U.S., NATO members in cyberspace, and what do you think the likelihood is that even if we don't see boots on the ground, you know, there might still be some sort of major cyber attack?
So I think, yes, that was good news, good reporting out this morning about potentially moving some of the battalions that were drilling. But at the same time, if you look in Kremlin, with the Duma putting forth a recommendation to the president that they recognize the Donbas region as independent, I think there's a potential for pretext there. And they've done that sort of thing before. So it looks like they're withdrawing. There's some sort of pretext for an attack, and then boom, we're right back in it. But stepping back, I think there's always the possibility for hitting against critical infrastructure. They will continue, and they've never stopped low-level cyber activity within Ukraine. I mean, that's the thing. This has been ongoing since 2014 and before. But also, and I think this goes to President Ilves's broader point, is that they view both the technical side of digitalization as well as the psychological side. And so there was some reporting about this Foundation for Strategic Culture or whatever that came out this morning, I believe, about how they've been manufacturing fake news reports that then get laundered through the ecosystem of different news outlets and pseudo news outlets that then start getting traction. And so it turns into this kind of participatory disinformation cycle, as Kate Starbird from the University of Washington would describe it. So you know, it's hard to predict, but we know that they have tools. We know they've used them before, and there is a non-zero chance that it could happen. So any risk managers out there, whether you're a cybersecurity specialist or a CISO or anything like that, needs to be taking some pretty basic precautions right now. And that includes, frankly, I would probably start spinning up a crisis management cell, pulling out your incident response playbook, maybe conducting a drill or an exercise or a rehearsal to ensure that everything's up and ready to go, and you have your all the people know, on the team know what they're supposed to be doing. Checking some of your basic cybersecurity controls, as I think the president also indicated, and just making sure that you're ready to take a hit, because as Nicole mentioned, you can't guarantee 100% security. And that's fundamentally behind what the administration was hitting at with the executive order back in May on zero trust. You have to assume that you're going to have a bad day. How do you minimize that bad day? And that is about defense in depth and the ability to respond and recover quickly minimize the blast radius of any sort of activity.
And Nicole, do you have any thoughts on that? And also, given that it's the last 5 minutes, any closing thoughts on this subject as well?
No, I'm just nodding along with Chris, thinking, preach. Everything Chris just said. Yeah, my optimistic take on our last year of ransomware attack after ransomware attack is that actually, they might be doing us a favor, because they are pen testing the United States and they are showing us just how vulnerable we are. And for the first time, boards of directors are asking their CIOs and their CEOs and their CISOs, what's it going to take to stop the next ransomware attack? And that has the added benefit of hardening our attack surface for the next nation state directed attack. Similarly, I think if we're paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine and we do all of the things that Chris just said, perhaps use this as an opportunity to run some drills and test our cyber resilience, maybe we will come out of this stronger. That is my hope. Ultimately, though, it is important to remember that unfortunately, as a democracy, as a free market economy, we are in some ways at a major disadvantage when it comes to our cyber defense. It is much harder now for our intelligence agencies, our cyber command to operate in China, because they've used the Great Firewall to their advantage. They are able to pretty quickly identify anomalous, suspicious activity and get it out of there. We don't have that luxury here. We don't want the NSA after everything the country went through and all the debates we had after Snowden. They don't want the NSA in our domestic networks. Okay, so that actually creates, some friction here. How do we make sure that our most vibrant companies, the companies that control our most critical infrastructure, know when an attack hits and know how to get up as quickly as possible and how to control the blast radius? And I think the only way to do that is, unfortunately, with some short-term pain. Hopefully that's been ransomware. Maybe it'll be Ukraine, before we get to the level of awareness that we need to get to really start taking this seriously. I always say, this will be my concluding thought, every major geopolitical conflict going forward, I truly believe will involve some cyber element to it. And the country that wins those conflicts will look like a digital Israel. Basically, a country that can continue to run its most basic services and perhaps even innovate while surrounded by hostile activity and hostile neighbors. And right now, unfortunately, in the United States, we are not that country. We might not win that conflict. And so what's it going to take for us to get to the level of awareness where we are creating smart, resilient cyber defenses?
And President Ilves, any closing thoughts as well?
Basically, all countries in Europe are under constant attack. Last week, Vodafone, which is a mobile telephone company providing 1/3 of the coverage in Portugal, went down. And the Portuguese said, it looks like it's Russia. I don't know if it is, but that's what the Portuguese authorities said. The other thing to do is to be ready. We have 99.9% of banking in my country is digital. Yet this week, or the end of last week, the minister in charge, inter alia, of digitization said, look, remember back 20 years ago, you used these little PIN calculators? Well, those will not be affected by a cyber attack. So we have to go back to more primitive technology, and we don't have to go to the bank. But if you want a bank, make sure you have one of these things, which I have not used since 2001. Nonetheless, I now have one because something goes wrong. So, this is also why I tell people, take out some cash, buy canned goods, because, okay, we don't think it'll last forever, but if things go south, and Estonia is highly digitized, then basically, they're the only things you can't do digitally in Estonia is get married, divorced, and buy property. So, we're sensitive to this and we've gone through it, but everybody should be sensitive to this, and everybody should be thinking through, what is it that I do as a citizen of my country that is vulnerable to digital disruption. And certainly banking is, credit cards are, all of those things can be shut down. I'm not saying they will be, but you want to think ahead.
And Chris, if you have any, one sentence, 2-sentence thoughts there.
I think President Ilves is spot on, and we've had this discussion before, but that's exactly why here in the United States, we have to continue investing in our election systems to get to 100% paper. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you for talking about this pretty dark and very present subject today. Yeah, stay tuned. I think it's a constantly evolving topic this week and the next. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.